It's one of the most shocking events in history, captured in one of the most haunting videos of all time. But even 60 years later, we still don't know the truth of what happened that day in Dallas. In this video, I'll be examining newly released documents and fresh eyewitness testimony that throws serious doubt on the official story, puts the CIA in the frame, and could finally prove that Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't the only assassin.
Israel going through my head that was repeating. It was just like a looped tape of the president's head.
In 2023, President Joe Biden finally cleared the long-delayed release of a final wave of files about the killing of his predecessor, John F. Kennedy, claiming 99% of files relating to the case are now publicly available. At the same time, a new witness came forward with devastating new testimony. So let's take a fresh look at the event that shook America to its core. At 11:40 a.m. on the 22nd of November 1963, Air Force One touches down at Love Field. Waiting for them is a motorcade that will take them on a 10-mile route through the city to a lunch at the Dallas Market Center. The President and Mrs. Kennedy, along with Texas Governor John Connally, his wife Nellie, and two Secret Service agents, board a Lincoln Continental limousine. Its convertible top is folded down, and unusually, there are no Secret Service personnel riding the rear bumper steps. Just a few feet back is a second vehicle. Known as the Halfback, this carries more Secret Service agents. Among them, the men assigned to protect the First Lady, Clint Hill, and 28-year-old Paul Landis, the youngest member of the Secret Service staff surrounding the Kennedys, and as a result, given the codename Debut. But Landis is now an experienced hand. For the past 2 years, he's travelled the world at Jackie Kennedy's side, guarding her every move, playing with her children, and being with her even during the medical emergency 3 months earlier that resulted in the death of her son Patrick at the age of just 2 days. Now, both men would become key actors in one of the most shocking events of the 20th century. With Landis on the right rear running board and Hill on the front left, the motorcade begins its journey. The official finding of the Warren Commission that investigated the assassination strips the horror of what happened next into a bare, straightforward story. Hiding on the 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository, overlooking the route of the motorcade, which the press had published days in advance, was a 24-year-old communist sympathizer and former Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald. As the president's limo passes through Dealey Plaza, Oswald fires 3 shots from a cheap Mannlicher Carcano M9138 bolt-action rifle. The first shot, says the report, misses the motorcade and hits the roadway. The second strikes President Kennedy in the neck, exited through his throat, and carries on to seriously wound Governor Connally. The final bullet hits Kennedy's head and is given as the cause of death. For those involved, the experience was very different. Special agents Clint Hill and Paul Landis are about 15 feet behind the president's limousine when the shots begin. Hill immediately jumps from the moving vehicle and sprints towards the presidential limo to try and shield the president. He's within a second of reaching the vehicle when the third shot rings out and the president's head seems to explode, showering Mrs. Kennedy, Hill, and even Landis in the car behind with blood and brain matter. Jackie climbs out of the rear seat towards him, trying, so Hill thinks, to catch a piece of her husband's skull that has blown onto the trunk. Pushing her back, the agent spread eagles across the back of the limo to shield the couple, screaming, "To the hospital! To the hospital!" as loudly as he can to the driver. On arrival there minutes later, Landis also runs forward from the halfback vehicle to help the First Lady and sees the full horror of what has just happened. Jackie Kennedy is now cradling her husband's body in her lap. She is covered in blood and already in deep shock. Though the president is still breathing, it's a gasping reflex action that makes the secret agents fear the worst. As Hill later testified, the right rear portion of his head was missing. It was lying in the rear seat of the car. His brain was exposed. There was blood and bits of brain all over the entire rear portion of the car. Mrs. Kennedy was completely covered with blood. There was so much blood you could not tell if there had been any other wound or not, except for the one large gaping wound in the right rear portion of the head.
As far away as we
Oddly, Landis himself was never interviewed about his experiences, either for the initial FBI inquiry, the Warren Commission report, or any of the subsequent investigations into the assassination. It took him 60 years to reveal what he claims happened next, and it could change our whole understanding of what occurred that day. Paul Landis seems never to have recovered from the events in Dallas. Within a year, he had left the Secret Service, suffering classic symptoms of what we know now as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Plagued by flashback visions of the president's head bursting apart and haunted by guilt, he tried to avoid all coverage of the killing for many years and would never speak of it. It wasn't until 2014 that he found out that the official record of the killing seemed to be wrong in one vital respect. Finally, in 2023, Landis told his version of what happened next. He and Clint Hill tried to coax Jackie Kennedy into letting go of the president's body. When she finally does, Hill and Agent Kellerman, who had been in the front of the limo, lift the president onto a hospital stretcher trolley and race him inside. Governor Connolly, also critically ill, is rushed away on another trolley. Left behind in the car to help the First Lady, Landis suddenly notices a bullet laying on the top of the bloodied rear seat. Knowing it's important evidence, but not thinking too clearly himself, Landis picks it up and puts it in his pocket, before escorting the First Lady into the emergency room. There, he says, he put the bullet on the stretcher that the president was laying on. It might not seem a big deal, but as I'll explain, it calls into question one of the most controversial parts of the Warren Commission's findings, that Oswald acted alone. Many experts and even some members of the commission itself had always doubted the conclusion that only one gunman was involved because of the so-called magic bullet. According to the single shooter theory, the second shot Oswald fired must have hit the president's neck, exited through his throat, then hit Governor Connolly, shattering a rib, breaking his wrist, and severing the femoral artery in his thigh, creating 7 entrance and exit wounds, passing through many layers of clothing and shattering several bones. Theoretically, that's possible, but the bullet said to have inflicted all this damage was, according to photographs, in pristine condition. Very different to the fragments found of the bullet that had, apparently, hit the president's head. The magic bullet wasn't even lodged in Governor Connolly's body when found. According to the Commission's findings, it was discovered on one of the hospital trolleys that was thought to be the one Connolly had been laying on. If it's actually the bullet that Landis placed on the president's trolley and the two stretchers were simply mixed up, the whole explanation of the attack could be wrong. Analysis of the Zapruder film shows the president and governor react to their injuries within a second of each other. For Oswald to have fired, reloaded, and fired again would have taken at least 2¼ seconds. Unless the bullet somehow went through the president, the governor, and then bounced back to land behind the president again, which would make it even more magical, then there's only one conclusion. If Connolly was hit by a different bullet, it must have been fired by someone else. The governor himself thought that was the case, claiming he had been hit by 2 bullets, which would be totally impossible with just one gunman. The existence of a second attacker would also throw fresh light on some of the other wounds the president received. According to the magic bullet theory, the hole in the front of JFK's throat was an exit wound made by the bullet before it hit Connolly. But hospital staff had used that hole to insert a breathing tube into his windpipe. They described it initially as a small entry wound. Any shots fired by Oswald could only have come from behind. An entry wound at the front would also suggest another shooter was involved. A bullet resting where Landis said he found one would also explain a further mystery. At the autopsy, doctors and FBI agents had been puzzled by a small entry wound on the president's shoulder that didn't have an exit wound. X-rays showed no sign of a bullet lodged in his body either. Ignoring this, the Warren Commission decided that wound must be connected to the exit wound in the throat and was the path the magic bullet took. But the ammunition Oswald was using were old World War II types and not very powerful. Ballistics showed the bullet Landis said he found behind the president had been fired from the rifle recovered from the sniper's nest in the book depository. An old, undercharged round fired at distance might well cause only a superficial flesh wound, with the bullet falling back out into exactly the position Landis claims he found it in. So is Paul Landis telling the truth? Or is his memory playing tricks on him? Special Agent Clint Hill says the story doesn't make sense to me. Other critics claim there is no evidence Landis was in the ER room at all. But incredibly, Phyllis J. Hall, a nurse who was part of the team trying to save Kennedy, also reported seeing a nearly pristine bullet on the trolley. I could see a bullet lodged between his ear and his shoulder. It was pointed at its tip and showed no signs of damage. I remember looking at it. There was no blunting of the bullet or scarring around the shell from where it had been fired. I'd had a great deal of experience working with gunshot wounds, but I had never seen anything like this before. That does pretty much match the description Landis himself gave, and also the description of the magic bullet itself. Yet Phyllis Hall's report was discounted by the Warren Commission, who claimed it must have been a bullet that had fallen out of a weapon carried by one of the Secret Service agents or the police. Just as with Landis, it was many years before she dared go public with her story. If the story she and Landis tell is true, it makes a second shooter much more likely, but gives no clues as to who or where that person may have been. Newly released documents contain no more information about suspects on the grassy knoll that has often been cited as the location for a second assassin. There is also a lack of forensic evidence for a second shooter. Most analysis still agrees the fragments found in the car and the bodies of the victims come from only 2 bullets, both seemingly fired from the rifle found in the Texas book depository. It doesn't mean there weren't more bullets, just that they were never found. But though the new sources don't point a finger at any suspects, they certainly do point to the idea that Oswald might not have been working alone. The 1992 President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act required every record relating to the JFK assassination to be released by October 2017, which didn't happen. Since then, there have been bursts of new documents landing, but despite a final release in June 2023, over 4,000 files still remain completely or partially hidden. Many more files and pieces of evidence, including X-rays of the president's body and even his brain, seem to have disappeared altogether. But there are some hints that may point to the real story of what happened that day. It's no surprise that many of the documents still under wraps are related to the CIA, because what has become increasingly obvious is that intelligence organizations knew far more about Lee Harvey Oswald than they ever admitted, even to the Warren Commission investigating the assassination. New releases seem to confirm the CIA had been monitoring Oswald for at least 3 years. This man, CIA operative Reuben Efron, was intercepting Oswald's mail and acted as translator for his Russian-born wife when she was interrogated by the Warren Committee. If he was translating correctly, or instead protecting sensitive information, we may never know. But there certainly seems to have been a security operation around Oswald, and especially his links to Russia and Cuba. New files also reveal the CIA also secretly monitored phone calls from Oswald to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. And some documents go further. Oswald is known to have travelled to the embassy in person, and sources claim that while he was there, he offered to assassinate Kennedy in return for Cuban citizenship, an offer the Cubans allegedly accepted in revenge for the Kennedy-backed plots they had uncovered to kill Cuban rebel leader Fidel Castro. Rumours claim that on the day of the killing, a Cuban aircraft was waiting at Dallas to take Oswald not to Havana as he expected, but to dispose of him in the ocean once he'd served his purpose. In the end, police caught up with Oswald before he could escape, and a couple of days later, Jack Ruby saved the Cubans the trouble of silencing him. The most recently released documents also show that Castro's Cuban rivals could have been in on the act, hand in hand with the Chicago Mafia. Legendary mob godfather Sam Giancana wanted to regain the Cuban gambling rackets lost when Castro's guerrillas seized power. So he enlisted a notoriously crooked cop and alleged CIA spy named Richard Kane to train anti-Castro forces in Kook country. That effort failed, but Kane's name has been mentioned before as a possible assassin of JFK on the orders of the mob. So who knows? If Paul Landis's claims are accurate and there was a second gunman waiting in Dallas, perhaps this man is him. 60% of Americans think that the true story has never been revealed. So what about you? Let me know in the comments. Check out these videos for more government secrets and be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.